Okay, we should be recording now. And welcome everyone. We're really glad to see you today. Thanks for taking time out of your day to join us. My name is Owens. I'm an associate professor of sociology at USC, and it's my pleasure to be the hostess for today's event. And this is really a unique event that's putting two books in conversation with one another. Redistributing the Poor, Jails, Hospitals, and the Crisis of Law and Fiscal Austerity, was published this year by Oxford University Press. And Bandage, Sort, and Hustle, Ambulance Crews on the Front Lines of Urban Suffering was published in 2020 by the University of California Press. And we're joined by both authors as well as by two excellent commentators. So let me introduce all four panelists before we get started. First, Armando Lara-Millán is the author of Redistributing the Poor. He's an assistant professor of sociology at University of California, Berkeley. And he's an ethnographer and historical sociologist who studies how powerful organizations shape people's life fortunes. Professor Lara-Millán's research engages a number of topics, including law, medicine, and criminal justice. His work has appeared in American Sociological Review, Qualitative Sociology, Criminology, and more. So we're really happy to hear Armando speak about his book. Josh Syme is the author of Bandage, Sort, and Hustle, and he's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Southern California. He's broadly interested in the governance of poverty and suffering, and this has led him into the sociologies of medicine, punishment, and labor. Professor Syme's research has appeared in American Sociological Review, Sociological Methods in Research, Punishment and Society, and other venues. And our commentators today are Michael Burawoy and Jennifer James. Michael Burawoy is a professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. His research and writing focus on labor, theory, ethnographic methods, among other topics. And he's the author of multiple books, including Manufacturing Consent, The Politics of Production, and the Extended Case Method. Professor Burawoy has also served as the president of both the American Sociological Association and the International Sociological Association. Our second commentator is Jennifer James, a sociologist and assistant professor at the Institute for Health and Aging at University of California, San Francisco. She's a qualitative researcher and Black feminist scholar whose research lies at the intersection of race, gender, and health. And her work has appeared in the American Journal of Bioethics, Journal of Pain and Symptom Management, and other outlets. Professor James also has a chapter coming out in the highly anticipated volume, Black Feminist Sociology with Routledge. Okay, so those are our four panelists, and today Armando and Josh are going to speak for 5 or 10 minutes each about they're going to summarize their own books and then say a few words about how Redistributing the Poor and Bandage, Sort, and Hustle might inform or interact with one another. We'll then hear comments from Michael and from Jennifer before we move into a conversation among all four of our panelists. And then we'll reserve the final 20 minutes or so for audience Q&A. So when that time gets closer, I'll invite you to either write your question in the chat or write, I have a question in the chat, and I'll call on as many people as time allows. So with all of that out of the way, we'll go ahead and begin, and we're gonna start with Professor Lara-Millán. Let me allow you to share your screen, Armando. Oops, I don't wanna share my screen. Okay, you should be okay to go whenever you're ready.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Okay, thank you everybody for being here. I really appreciate it. I know this is at the end of the school year, almost, I guess, the summer now. So, I appreciate all your time. Well, I'm just going to start here. I'm going to take about 10 minutes of your time, not 5. It was a challenge distilling a whole book into that amount of time, but I was excited to give it a shot. I'll just start here. When sociologists refer to this idea of poverty governance, they're making reference to a wide variety of activity. But it usually has something to do with formal organizations, both inside and outside the state, that are charged with the daily intervention into the lives of the poor. The intervention can be both, and it is often both for the purposes of harming and helping poor people. Some of our most recent news involves such organizations, the police involved in the killing of more Black and brown people, the caging of unaccompanied minors at the border, which is now, the crisis is now returned under a third president. And to use Josh's, an example from Josh's book, the phenomenon of the overwhelming, not underwhelming, presence of ambulance services in our nation's working class neighborhoods. The particular problem that Redistributing the Poor takes on is the expansion of medicine in large urban jails and its medicine's restriction in large public hospitals during the past 30 years or so. What does it mean? What do I mean by when I say medicine is expanding in jails and becoming more restricted in public hospitals? Well, the fieldwork I conducted for a year in 2 such institutions kind of helped me frame that puzzle. In the jail, the ubiquity of medicine as a form of knowledge and technology to understand inmates and run a jail smoothly. In the public hospital, the ubiquity of criminal suspicion to understand patients and make tough choices about who should receive very scarce public hospital beds. In the jail, nurses, doctors, therapists, psychotropic drugs, sedatives, mental health evaluation forms, they all sprang into action whenever there was a disruption to the normal routine of jailing. In the hospital, the ubiquity of criminal stigma was all around me. Not only were police, jailers, squad cars, and handcuffs a continuous presence there, so was the suspicion that patients who overcrowded the ER were not very sick at all, but instead were out to abuse the hospital as a source of drugs. These ethnographic findings, which make up important chapters of the book, make sense given broader trends in our nation's jails and public hospitals. In 2010, it's estimated around 20% of those in jail have serious mental illness, while the restriction of medicine in public hospitals also makes sense given well-known capacity declines. There were about 1,600 public hospitals open in 1983. By 2003, only 60% remained. Whenever this topic is raised between jails and public hospitals, some version of the following idea is repeated. It's this kind of existing explanations. That because we as a society disinvested in public health, particularly mental health institutions during the 1960s, the sick and poor now find themselves within the purview of criminal justice institution. It's actually 3 related but distinct theories. The deinstitutionalization thesis points to the closure of those psychiatric institutions as an explanation. The problem with this deinstitutionalization thesis, however, is that it doesn't explain jail administrators' willingness to provide healthcare resources in jail. The enormous spending that goes on in jails is anecdotally available. For instance, New York City's jail spending grew by 175%. Healthcare spending in its jails grew by 175% during the past 10 years. We can get some indirect figures about medical personnel in jails. In 1988, there were around 2,000 medical professionals serving in our largest jails, and that doubled by 1999. To think these numbers are solely related to the presence of mentally ill in jails would be naive. The numbers relate to the willingness of administrators to pay the salaries of medical professionals and pay the costs that go along with accreditation. This thesis is often paired with this idea of retrenchment criminalization of social welfare institutions. It would explain the decline of medicine in public hospitals with the attempt of politicians since the 1970s to curb social expenditures through the application of market rationality and the racialization of public spending in large cities. It's often paired with the rise of crime control techniques or criminalization in public institutions. The best known examples, of course, are policing techniques in urban public schools and welfare offices. It might be tempting to apply this argument to public hospitals, but the empirical story is actually quite the opposite. From 1992 to 2008, Medicaid funding nearly tripled, and that squares with rising prices. Exactly during the period of public hospital decline, mechanisms were created under the Ronald Reagan administration to mandate that ERs accept all care without the ability to pay and to funnel public money into hospitals that had a disproportionate share for uncompensated care. This funding survived 2 attempts to turn it into a block grant. So this is a story of resilience in public hospital funding in spite of major efforts to dismantle them. And you can see some of those figures here. These two theses are often paired with this broad history of mass imprisonment, which I'm sure we're all quite familiar with, the fourfold rise in the imprisonment rate. It may be surprising to hear, though, that jail systems in America's largest cities stopped expanding in the early 1990s. And by largest cities here, I mean the counties in the top 50 MSAs in the country, stopped expanding, and their inmate populations flattened in the early 1990s and have been oscillating ever since, adding or subtracting 1,000 inmates annually, depending on the annual budget. The situation, it characterizes those top 50 MSAs, which collectively represent about 30% of the nation's jail population. These jurisdictions experimented with all kinds of early release mechanisms and alternative to incarceration. So with these existing explanations kind of forming the background to what we see going on in jails and hospitals, but they don't by themselves explain the expansion of medicine and restriction in public hospitals. And so in the book, I try to develop the use of a new, what I think is a pretty interesting way of pairing ethnographic evidence with historical evidence, archival evidence. Because it's often the case that in place of actual histories of field sites, ethnographies of poverty governance institutions make use of broad theories like the ones I just mentioned to explain the origins of what they found, even if those theories don't fully fit the case. The alternative I propose is pairing ethnographic puzzles with archival history. I call this in the book historically embedded ethnography. That's exactly what I did. I discuss it more in the appendix. I embedded what I found in observations of two confidential institutions and paired in the archival history of LA County. On this point, I would love to hear about how his conceptualization of vertical and horizontal tracing interacts with the passage of time, critical junctures, and historical evidence. The history was perfect for me because LA County's jails and hospitals were more closely fit the countervailing trends, capacity declines in jails, and funding resilience in public hospitals that fit that national trend. I use that history. And here you see a picture my friend took of with a drone of the hospitals in the far back left and the Twin Towers jails in the front there. And the archival history mainly was about these guys here. Here you see the Board of Supervisors grilling the Sheriff's Department. The history and field work I used to formulate a new theory to explain this puzzle. And it's the confluence, what I argue, it's the confluence of austerity and legal demand that creates the conditions for a transformation of these kinds of institutions. As I show, state officials confront ever decreasing resources at the exact same time that new legal rules force them to expand access, provide more services, and enforce rules that have been neglected. We've already seen how budget retrenchment affected jail sizes, but the problem of austerity runs much deeper. No deliberation on urban poverty governance, in my view, can move forward without addressing the limits on city resources. Close to 300 municipalities are currently in default on their debt. Alongside limits on fiscal resources, what's lost in many analysis of poverty governance are what legal historians and political scientists call the judicialization of American politics. What this means is that a large share of policy questions have become judicial questions, answered not through political party representation, grassroots mobilization, or coalition building, but through litigation. Some of this appears in Josh's third section of Bandage, Sort, and Hustle, with the company mandated to produce certain kinds of numbers that appease regulators. What happens when officials are forced by legal imperatives to expand programs during a budget shortfall? It almost doesn't make sense. It's kind of like a magic trick. I developed this concept of redistributing the poor to illustrate how state agencies resolve this tension. The idea describes how state agencies circulate people between different institutional spaces in order to raise revenue, and that's the reason for it, to raise revenue, and project the illusion that services have been rendered in legally adequate ways. Redistribution unfolds through three processes. First, state officials work to reclassify the people they're in charge of. This means that public officials will re-articulate the kinds of interventions that wards are thought to require, for instance, by emphasizing the mental health needs of a jail population over their security risks. Second, the reclassification allows the movement of such wards into different institutional spaces or changing the kinds of interventions those spaces are thought to provide. By doing so, they can make claims on revenue from other state agencies, both those horizontally located, for instance, such as a mental health department providing services and revenue to a jail, and those vertically located, such as a jail pulling in revenue from a state health tax, or renting out space to state and federal agencies. Third, it's a continuous movement between old space and repurposed space that projects this illusion that services have been rendered in legally adequate ways. In total, the three processes align officially recognized demand with precious revenue. This theoretical model can help us understand the expansion of medicine in jails and its restriction of public hospitals a bit better. Because the legal pressure in jails orients administrators toward decompression, this structured the kind of redistributions they could pursue. County officials shifted from thinking about their inmate populations primarily as violent gang members to spur jail growth, to thinking about them as mentally ill, substance abusers, and less criminally threatening homeless persons. Doing so allowed them to funnel in new forms of revenue in their jails from state and federal agencies in the effort to keep dying institutions afloat. The specific character of legal pressure on the hospital system, oriented towards keeping hospital beds open as opposed to decompression, structures the kind of redistributions they could pursue. County officials shifted from thinking about their patient population as seriously, urgently sick inpatients to thinking about them as outpatients, homeless persons, and immigrants who are all somehow less seriously sick. Doing so allowed county officials to obtain revenue from the federal government while also rationalizing the delay of patients and extremely long waiting times. In total, jails have moved to expand medicine not only because they're seeing more mentally ill arrestees, but because reorganizing their jails along these lines allowed them to tap into new revenue sources and new means of abdicating responsibility. Likewise, hospitals moved to restrict access not simply due to cutbacks and criminalization, but because doing so allowed them to generate revenue from new sources and to rationalize extreme wait times. Redistribution of the poor is a product of the distinct agencies acting alone, often in conflict with other agencies, over who will have responsibility for different categories of people and the public revenue attached to them. There are moments when statecraft in which poor people are legally and technically provided with a service, but their needs are re-articulated into a different kind of need that produces revenue for the state or more conservative budgeting. So I'll leave it there. I'm pretty sure I came in at 11 minutes.
Thank you so much. And next we will hear from Josh Syme.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I don't have any slides, so I'm just going to share a few notes here, and I'll be relatively brief. Vandersort and Hustle is a book on how ambulance crews helped to govern urban suffering. I feel compelled to explain what I mean by urban suffering and what I mean by the governance of urban suffering. So in no way am I suggesting that people who dwell in cities live in absolute or permanent misery. They don't. In fact, there's a lot of sociological research that suggests that people who live in cities actually tend to be happier and healthier on average than those who do not live in cities. And so public health scholars sometimes call this the urban health advantage. But all cities, all human settlements contain suffering. And we've long known since the writings of Frederick Engels, W.B. Du Bois, Jane Addams, Chicago School of Sociology, and onward, that suffering in a multitude of forms, physical suffering, emotional suffering, mental suffering, tends to concentrate towards the bottom of the economically and racially polarized city. So as I say in the book, suffering seems to obey a kind of social gravity. There's something in the cosmos that tends to pull suffering towards the bottom of a complex urban hierarchy. Now, I'm particularly interested in the governance of urban suffering, how state and state delegated institutions manage, regulate, or handle those populations that bear the brunt of suffering in the city, either by aiding those populations, by punishing those populations, or simply by processing them into objects to know and direct. Now, I argue that the ambulance is an ideal case for studying the governance of urban suffering, because it is an institution that is explicitly concerned, like its manifest mission is to treat and to transport critically ill and injured populations. Its explicit mission is to govern urban suffering. I show that in the book that it's a little bit more complicated than that, but it at least provides a good starting point of suggesting that this is a good case. Now, I study ambulance operations in a private 911 ambulance firm that holds contracts throughout the country. I focus on its operations in one unnamed California county. And more specifically, in that organization, I examine the ambulance labor process. So I'm drawing this concept from Marx and from other labor sociologists, how labor power is converted into actual productive activity. And if you're going to study the labor process, you have to examine the social relations of production. So this means accounting for the relations between ambulance workers and the subjects of their work, their patients, as well as the relations between ambulance workers and those who are attempting to control and to coordinate their labor from above, as well as the horizontal relations between ambulance workers and other frontline personnel who are often sharing their clientele, mainly nurses at hospitals and police on the street. Methodologically, I draw on 3 sources of data. So the first year of my research, I spent doing ride-along observations, shadowing ambulance crews, shadowing managers, attending a number of management meetings. This is what we might call participant observation in a kind of traditional form. My second year of fieldwork, I repositioned myself from being a ride-along to being a novice emergency medical technician. And during that time, I kind of bent the ethnographic gaze back onto myself, at least more so than in the first year, to make sense of my own shifting dispositions and subjectivities as I, quote, became an EMT. This is what we might call observant participation, something that emphasizes the activities of participation over observation, or an inversion of that typical relationship. And then I also draw on over 100,000 medical records. So these are documents, these are records completed by ambulance crews in the field. The title of the book spoils the argument. I argue that ambulance crews govern urban suffering by bandaging suffering bodies, offering simple and superficial solutions to the deep and complicated structural problems of a capitalist and racist society. That it helps to sort suffering bodies, helping to distribute those populations across an array of often contradictory institutions and sorting them within those institutions. And then it helps to hustle suffering bodies, rushing suffering bodies through, but not necessarily toward interventions, and usually doing this in the name of organizational efficiency, or in my case, in the name of profit. Now, I think that there are many similarities between Bandage, Sort, and Hustle and Redistributing the Poor. And these are books that, in my opinion, pair well together. And I think that we can read each book from the standpoint of the other. And so I'll offer some comments on Redistributing the Poor from the standpoint of my framework in Bandage, Sort, and Hustle. So this idea of bandaging, I think most approximates what Armando was referring to as the disappearing of suffering. It's not a perfect match, but there is something to be said about how in both of our books, we emphasize how these interventions don't target the root causes of people's suffering and often present themselves as being a policy success. So a fast ambulance response time or relatively fast processing through the emergency department, but they don't address the root causes of people's suffering. This idea of sorting is most obviously connected to what Armando is referring to as redistribution. And what's interesting is that across both of our books, we're showing how this redistribution process at ground level necessitates labor. It necessitates frontline workers in interaction with one another, be they jailers in interaction with nurses or cops in interaction with ambulance crews. And then this idea of hustling. So I don't use this exact language, but I certainly explain this as a process that unfolds as a result of legal demand and profit seeking. So ambulances, 911 ambulances, the state at multiple levels, even when they're privately contracted, promises people an ambulance. When you call, and regardless of your ability to pay, the ambulance should be delivered to you. And more often than not, it will deliver on that promise. But for ambulance companies, this is a problem because a lot of people who call for ambulance services are uninsured or they're on means-tested Medicaid, and that doesn't provide a very thick revenue stream for the company. And so there's this instant contradiction between the demands of delivering services and the profit-seeking endeavors of the company. Now, for Armando, he's not focused on profit-seeking, but rather fiscal austerity. But I think it could be the case that the profit-seeking endeavors of my company are probably linked back to earlier efforts to establish a fiscally austere city or something like that. Now, I also think there are some complementary differences between Bandage, Sort, and Hustle and Redistributing the Poor. I mean, they both, in some sense, pursue different theoretical ends. One's focused on the redistribution of the poor, one is focused on the labor process. And I think this invites, as all different project with different theoretical focuses. It invites different scopes of analysis, different targets of analysis, and so on. So Bandage, and Hustle details the emotional and the vocational dimensions of frontline work and focuses heavily on the relations between frontline workers and their managers, in particular their immediate managers and their near immediate managers. Redistributing the Poor doesn't fully ignore these things, but they're not essential to the argument. Likewise, Redistributing the Poor offers more historical depth and focuses heavily on actions above the immediate managers of frontline labor, including amongst boards of supervisors and whatnot. Now, Bandage, and Hustle doesn't fully ignore those things, but they're not essential to the analysis of that particular book. I also think it's worth noting that there are divergent departures here from participant observation. Both Armando and I seem to suggest that participant observation in and of itself is insufficient for our particular cases. So for Armando, this means doing historically embedded ethnography and going into the archives. And for me, this means combining participant observation with what I call observant participation into a form of a method I refer to in another article as hybrid ethnography. And I also draw on these different medical records as well. I also think it's worthwhile to think beyond Bandage, and Hustle and Redistributing the Poor and to consider what's missing and what's underdeveloped across both of our books. So I think if you're really interested in like the clientele experience and the experiences of patients and the experiences of incarcerated people, I think our books will leave you a little bit underwhelmed. But I think both Armando and I have justifications for that. So we both essentially argue that there's great research out there accounting for patient experiences, the experiences of people who are caught up by the penal state. And we suggest that we need more sociologists to study up, to study those institutions that are managing these populations and governing these populations. For me, this means studying up to the front lines and into the relations that these workers enter into to manage these populations. And for Armando, it means in some sense extending really far up into accounting for these different political decisions. But nonetheless, the clientele experience, the experience of people who are being processed is certainly important, and it is something that's a little bit undeveloped across our books. I also think that our books perhaps don't do enough to account for variations within labor, within the front line. So for example, we both detail how frontline workers can be sexist and racist towards their clientele, towards their patients, towards their police subjects, and so on. We do not, however, account for how the workers themselves can be the subjects or the targets or the victims of racism and sexism. We don't, for example, account for a gendered or racialized division of labor. Of course, no book is perfect, and certainly no book is exhaustive. I can only hope that Redistributing the Poor and Bandage, and Hustle inspire new research, particularly as they're put in conversation with one another. I'm really honored that my book is associated with Redistributing the Poor in this event. You know, it's always hard to evaluate the merit of your own work, but I know for sure that Armando's book is excellent. So if Bandage, and Hustle is mentioned in positive reference to Redistributing the Poor, I'll take that as a good sign. And with that, I'll end it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Josh. I feel similarly honored to be invited to participate with both of these great books. We will now turn to some comments from Professor Michael Burawoy and Professor Jen James, and we're going to start with Michael. Michael, you should be able to share your screen. Let me know if you can't.
Yeah, I don't need to do it just yet. I'll talk a little bit, and Josh has already sort of taken the steam out of some of my comments. I thought he might. Yeah, well, it is a great honor to be talking about these two books, with which I've been reading various versions of them for the last, well, I don't know, about 10 years. And it's been great. It's been a great trajectory for me. I've learned an enormous amount from both these books and their authors. And I'm just delighted to see that they're between covers, and I will not be reading them again. They are tremendous books, and they're sort of firmly firmly entrenched in my brain. They are two amazing ethnographies, and one, and they, as Josh has already been saying, they sort of take a different approach to ethnography, which I think will mark them as books of departure in ethnography. And they're both very conscious of the context within which the ethnographic field takes place and the ethnographic research takes place. It's really great to compare the two books because I think, and again, as Josh was just saying, that they are incredibly neat. I always say that, you know, two's a million times bigger than one. And in this case, it really is true that the two are so interestingly complementary and give us a really rich, individually and even more collectively, understanding of the governance of urban poverty. So let me just summarize. I've got two slides in which I sort of represent the two books, but let me just summarize what I want to say about the two books. The first is indeed their complementarity, and that they're both concerned with the interface, ultimately the interface between the state and the client population of the state. And it is indeed the case that Josh really focuses on that labor process in the ambulance and the connections of the ambulance to the police and the hospital on the one side, and to, which he didn't say much about in his summary, and to the outsourced agency that sort of oversees the actual operation of the ambulance. That's the hierarchical dimension. So it is, I think, in itself a very unique and interesting approach to urban governance through the perspective of labor and drawing very much, I might say, even Marxist theories of the labor process associated with a sort of tradition that perhaps has sort of is disappearing, but perhaps will now be given new energy by the focus upon the state as actually the site of a labor process. And that's very different from, in some ways, from Armando. Armando actually starts out as an ethnographer, but then gets really puzzled by what, you know, he told us, you know, the restriction of healthcare in hospitals and its expansion in jails. And then looks at various theories that just doesn't make sense. They don't make sense because, and this is, of course, a unique feature of Armando's book, is that it looks at things historically. If you look at things historically over the last 10, 20, 30 years, at the expenditures and the focus of activities in jails and hospitals, one really comes up with a very puzzling phenomenon, which is indeed the focus of his book, reduced in the book as largely revolving around, as I say, the restriction of healthcare in hospitals, which you might be surprised when you learn that how much extra funding has gone to hospitals, and then the turning of jails into places where inmates are regarded as mental patients. But in figuring out that puzzle, he is driven upwards and upwards to the state, to the local state, and the state, the California state, and eventually even the federal state. And in proceeding in that sort of vertical movement, he generates a theory of the state that actually, for me, is reminiscent of a book by Jim O'Connell, The Fiscal Crisis of the State, was, I don't know, published in 1972 or somewhere, that talks about the accumulation and the legitimation crisis of the state. Now, Armando doesn't talk about it in those precise terms. He talks about it in terms of fiscal austerity on the one side and legal accountability on the other. It is these twin pressures, and we should remember that so often we think about fiscal austerity being the major focus, but actually the whole point of Armando's book is to actually combine the two and to see how the state is subject to this double pierce, the double attack. On the one side, it has to be legally accountable. On the other side, it has to deal with the financial strains that hit different agencies at different times. So there we have, on the one hand, we have Armando looking very much at the state, the way that different agencies in the state, it's not the state, it is different agents of the state and different levels of the state, how they interact and work together in order to respond to these two external pressures, and how that leads to the puzzling phenomenon of restriction of healthcare in hospitals and expansion in jails. I think one of the key features of both books, perhaps underemphasized, is the role of the state in classification and sometimes reclassification, which is not exactly the same, on the one side, and redistribution on the other. I think that, you know, if we take Armando's book, he uses those terms explicitly, and we see how reclassification of jail inmates leads to their redistribution. We see how the reclassification of jail inmates locally in terms of their risk leads to their expulsion into the community. So the reclassification and the redistribution actually work together. And I think that is very important, because so many people talk about the classificatory role of the state, but they don't talk about the redistribution, which is the material consequence of reclassification. And for Josh, well, he didn't mention, funnily enough, the one thing that strikes everybody when they read the book or when they hear him talk about his ethnography is the way that the ambulance drivers, the EMTs, how they distinguish between two types of clients and two types of calls, legit and bullshit. Now, this legit and bullshit, but basically the ambulance, as Josh has described, is concerned with, has become the fulcrum of mopping up people from the streets who are in some way or another have been marginalized, who are in many different ways suffering from the urban malaise of marginality. And many of those calls, most of the calls the ambulance get are not to do with the medical ailment of the sufferer, but the problem of simply being marginal and poor. And those are, from the ambulance points of view, those are the bullshit calls, and they're looking for the legit calls, which are the sort of the true medical calls. And what is so interesting is that this is a classification that is also invented, not at the top of the state, but actually on the street level. And that classification leads to distribution to different agencies. So again, you see in both of these books really revolve around reclassification stroke classification and redistribution stroke distribution. Yes. All right. I will not bother you with my pictures. I've spoken enough. I do want to emphasize what Josh did say at the end. You read the book and you do wonder, what is the perspective of those who are the clients of the state, those who are being in a sense mopped up by the ambulance, and those who are being pushed aside into the community, perhaps people from inmates from the jails or the hospitals. There's the growth of the inpatient population and the outpatient population, and its regulation, and early versions of Armando's book was about the criminalization of the hospitals. So this is another interesting feature of the experience. And what we don't hear about, as Josh says, we don't hear about what it is like to be those who are being pushed around or reclassified. And it's not simply that they're absent, Josh. And I'm glad you recognize that. And there's nothing, as you say, we can't do everything. It's not simply that we don't but the question I have is, to what extent actually do the inmates, do the homeless, to what extent do they actually shape what is going on in the state that is the focus of how do we understand it? How should we conceptualize the way that they shape the way the ambulance operates, the way the prison operates, the way the hospital operates? There is, I think, there should be some sort of dialectic, to use a terrible word, there should be some sort of dialectic between the clients of the state and the operation of the state. So bringing them back in may give us a different vision of classification, stroke distribution, and when a different vision of that may actually sort of ascend the ladder and actually make us think about the ways in which the apparatus of the state, the different agencies of the state themselves think of urban governance. But yeah, these books, it's great that they came out at the same time, and I really hope that people read them together, because together they are even better than they are individually. And I'm delighted to be able to talk about this here today. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. And we'll turn to our next commenter, Professor Jennifer James. So Jen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. You know, it's been so great to hear these last three. I feel like I'm sort of disadvantaged in two ways, but maybe advantaged in two ways. Of I'm both going last, and I've clearly read the books fewer times than everybody else on the panel. I've read each of them only once, didn't live any of it, wasn't in early drafts. So I think I'm getting sort of the freshest take. And, you know, I'm really so honored to be able to be in conversation with you all today, to be able to have read these tremendous works together. I echo what Michael says about how interesting and fascinating it was to read them together, and just thinking, this is not what my planned remarks are, but just responding to your last idea, I'm now envisioning a team-based layered ethnography where, you know, you take the same, you know, one person is doing the streets, one person's doing the jail, one the hospital, different types of workers all together in the same time period in the same community. And what a cool project you could do, sort of having everybody's perspectives and layering them together, because looking at these different types of workers in conversation produced such, it was just such a rich way to consume both of your work. I think over the last week, since I've read these books, I've been seeing connections between them certainly at nearly every avenue of my academic and personal life. As a medical sociologist who's doing research on incarceration, there was just so much that felt directly applicable to my work, especially now as I'm finishing a couple papers on California jails during the pandemic. And I'll admit, when I first saw information about this event and these two books, I naively or ignorantly thought, I was like, you know, these books look great, but what do they have in common? Like, ambulances, of course, serve hospitals, but is the story of the ambulance parallel to the story of urban jails and hospitals? And the answer is resoundingly yes, it definitely is. I see why they were together. And I think these two books really brilliantly articulate how urban suffering is handled at the ground level by situating different workers as they go about organizing the people who are sort of living at the margins. So just to say briefly a little bit about each book. So Bandage, and Hustle, focused on the ambulance worker. I'll admit I'm a huge methodology nerd. I'm someone who always starts with the methods appendix, and this book really didn't disappoint. My cat is also a big fan of the book, wanted to clap by and say hello. So, you know, reading through this book, it was just fascinating to see the way Josh's understanding of ambulances, ambulance workers, and the people they serve shifted as he moved between ethnographer and EMT. And I feel like Josh couldn't put on sort of any of the false pretense of being merely an objective observer, a fly on the wall. He lived this life, and that richness, you know, came into this beautiful ethnography. And I think it made it so unique that he sort of served in both capacities. I think it's, you know, it's not atypical, necessarily abnormal for someone to conduct an ethnography in a setting where they also have worked or do work. In the context of this conversation, I think about Carolyn Sufrin's work on jail care, where she also worked as an OB. But I think, you know, Josh is so unique in doing the opposite, that he sort of started as an ethnographer and then moved to worker. And I think this context, allowing him to sort of see what he saw as a researcher, how he reflected inwardly as a worker, added so much complexity and richness to what we learned about the worker experience that I think would have been missed. And it was just so fantastic to read. And then in Redistributing the Poor, takes such a different approach. Instead of sort of being weaved in and out of ethnographer versus worker, Armando took us in and out of sort of the present and the past, offering ethnography of both modern day jails and hospitals and the historical context that brought us into this present moment. And I think between these two books, I was really able to see this sort of problem of the urban poor in historical, political, capitalistic contexts, and from the perspective of so many of the workers who have been tasked with the sorting, the hustling, and the redistributing of these problematized bodies. So I just want to make 2 or 3 points of connection and reflection. So first, I too was fascinated by the ways in which people are sorted and categorized, both formally and informally, with letters and numbers and labels. So legit or bullshit, urgent or not urgent, high security, medium security. And the way that the workers in ambulances and EDs and jails all seem to want their work to be focused on the former. They all wanted the real cases, right? The people who really needed their services, who really needed to be there. But in all these cases, there was an assumption that most, if not all, who were in the latter category were trying to game the system in some way. So these workers witness people in really extreme needs of shelter, food, sleep, shower, medication, whatever, who in their mind were using them and their services as a means to access these other things that weren't tied directly to the services they offer. And it's easy when you're reading to feel judgment at the workers for this, especially when we hear the context of the way they describe people and the racism and the sexism that comes into play. You think, why don't you have more compassion? Why can't they see that these are suffering people who need help, even if it's maybe not the most appropriate context in which that they want to get help? But I think Josh's experience, especially his transition from ethnographer to worker, really brings us along to help us get it, that like these bullshit cases, the fakers, they create more work. And I just can't help think about, how many of us as academics, we complain profusely over the number of unnecessary emails we get, the faculty meetings that run too long. And in so many ways, it just seems like these people are the manifestation of that. They're who detracts people from the real work they feel they ought to be doing, and the interventions they want to provide to help the most people. And sort of that tension was really clarified to me for this. It helped me have more empathy for the workers, even though it's easy, I think, in a lot of my work that does center more on the people, to villainize these workers for these, for the way they treat people, for the way they talk about people. But but I think because of this framework, because of this assumption that most people accessing services don't need to be there, don't need to be accessing these services in all these settings, it seemed to me like illness in a lot of ways it's a commodity or a tool. It becomes something that can offer alternative trajectories. And in many ways, because these people have operated within these systems for so long, they're taught that they have to present themselves in certain ways to receive certain care or outcomes, or the sorting that they desire or require. So it made me think about the ways that people are forced or taught to be performative in some ways, how to perform illness, how to perform being bad or dangerous, how to perform being mad or unstable in some way. And the presumption that people are using ambulances, using the jail, using the hospital for their ulterior motives, manipulating things that people think they should be able to do for themselves. These institutions, for better or worse, these are the social safety net, right? Ambulances, jails, hospitals, the ED, those are our social safety net. And yet people are othered or villainized for using them as such, for using them as a way to access needed services, especially those who do it often and are known to the system. And that was something that was true across both books. The people who were known, who were familiar, that was the clearest marker of someone who was not needing, was not deserving, was a manipulator. The idea that Armando presented, that there are people who in some ways aren't seen as criminal enough to deserve jail within our system, of mass incarceration, of militarized policing, really sort of blew my mind. And there was a quote in Armando's book about the undeserving poor being the cockroaches fighting over crumbs. And it felt so true to how many of the workers have sort of come to see these people that they work with. And it also just sort of reified for me how depressing it is that we're sort of constantly engaging in public policy debates about if we're giving these cockroaches too many crumbs, right? But what I found most fascinating is that this work of needing to perform illness, or needing to perform that you're a certain level of dangerous or a certain level of mentally ill or unstable, what was most fascinating to me is that this wasn't only being done by patients themselves. The workers were also finding ways to emphasize or de-emphasize illness or badness or madness. The workers were finding ways to use these other institutions and other workers to suit their own needs, which I think brings me to my second big takeaway I want to make, which is the way that these two works, especially in conversation together, I think make great strides in complicating or dispelling ideas we have about criminalization and medicalization as being distinct processes that are used for controlling bodies or approaching social problems. I think we often think, take a social problem, you medicalize it or you criminalize it. Those are two different approaches. And I think these books say that they're not, only sort of different sides of the same coin. We saw explicitly how cops would sort of ask people on the streets, you want to go to jail or do you want to go to the hospital? They're sort of presented as two options to solve the same problem, but there's people, these people and their presence was seen as a problem. And medicalization or criminalization could be used to redistribute the problem elsewhere. But what I'm fascinated by is the ways in which medicalization and criminalization were deployed in tandem. So Armando discussed the way medicalization is used as a tool to resolve organizational problems of overcrowded jails and to move, it also was described in Josh's book about how to move problematic bodies off the street and the ways that medical workers felt frustrated in both books of people they perceived should have been criminalized who were instead medicalized and becoming their problem when there was no easy solution in the ER setting. Criminalization tactics like physical and chemical restraint were used to make someone more amenable or able to have medical interventions. Criminality could be sort of nudged down using medicine as a reason to keep someone out of being labeled high security. So you could redistribute people differently. People then sort of act up in those spaces to attempt being downgraded medically, which makes their criminality go up. All of which, and all of these needs, all the ways this is done is based on scarcity. It's based on not having enough resources, finding new ways to organize them. There was this description of how someone now may be treated as mentally ill when in the past they might have been labeled or emphasized to be a violent gang member. And I think on the outside, this seems like a really clear instance of the way that our medicalizing policies have, overshadowed criminalizing work on an individual level. But what I think is important to note is that, this happened within a criminalized context. It's not either or, it's them operating together. This individual is very much still criminalized, and that this distinction isn't necessarily made for the benefit of the individual. It's not that we think this person needs more medical services. This is a better way for us to organize how we're categorizing people to serve the most people or to make the best use of our resources, which feels really different. How it's a tool for redistributing people and resources to meet the needs of organizations or of workers on the front line. And so in the hospital, which is a clearly medicalized space, just seeking care because of the use of pain medications that are distributed in the waiting room Armando describes that just entering that space can thus be understood as an act or marker of criminality. You're drug seeking. So the ways that which medicalization and criminalization can't be separated from each other in all of these contexts was so stark to me, the way that they're unavoidable for people who need to access any type of service. And so overall, I think both these books told the story that there's not enough beds in shelters, there's not enough beds in hospitals, there's not enough resources. And these workers are left to pick up the pieces to sort and redistribute these problematized bodies, which just creates revolving doors both within and among all these institutions. I think these books really showed how intrinsically sort of the left hand of the state and the right hand of the state are linked to each other, how much they're working together on the ground level, every day very closely. And yet the ultimate goal of the state is so unclear. Do they understand what they're doing on a higher level? And is all this work ultimately going anywhere? Are these institutions leading towards any social change, any long-term effects? Or are we just in a perpetual revolving door cycle forever? And I think for me, these books really perfectly encapsulated some of the challenges of things like decarceration and abolition, and perhaps even universal healthcare, without making fundamental social change. I personally think we must incarcerate fewer people, but where do those people go? Whose problem do they become? And that's sort of what really was brought to me, is that as long as we continue to see people as a problem and treat them that way, we're just going to continue to redistribute, to resort where they go. So I just wanted to end with a few questions that were raised for me. So first is sort of, given the labeling work, the performance done by both workers and patients, is anyone ever truly sick, truly dangerous, truly mentally ill, and who gets to decide that? I'm curious what you both think these books can teach us about the pandemic and our responses to the pandemic. What has this meant sort of during the last year? What are the ways in which medicine, medical advocacy, the work of healthcare workers has expanded the carceral state, and what are the implications of that? And finally, sort of given what we learned here, how or can we imagine an abolitionist future? What could the future look like given what you know about the state of things currently and the historical context that brought us here? So thank you so much for the opportunity to engage with your work.
Great, thank you so much, Jen, for those comments. And I think we are now at the portion of the show where we'll have just sort of an open conversation among our panelists to either for our authors to respond to the commentators or raise other issues. So we'll do this for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for Q&A. So I'll just hand the floor over to you four and let you kind of navigate a conversation.
I guess I could pick up. Jen and Michael, thank you for those comments. Those are incredible. You know, the strand I'm going to pick up now, I'm just thinking about the pandemic, and maybe it's a way to entree into some of these issues that we've talked about. You know, I was thinking the other day, so Alameda County sort of started filling up its jails again recently. In the early pandemic, they had been sued and they had released a ton of people because of COVID. And I was thinking about how, you know, I mean, periodically I feel threatened by the police walking around Oakland, where I live. If I was arrested today, I likely would spend 48 hours in jail. And we know from much work, and I'm thinking of Sandra Smith's work, my former colleague Sandra Smith at Harvard, about the severe consequences of spending 48 hours in jail, lifelong consequences. And if I had been arrested a year ago, last spring, I likely would have been cited and released because of administrative policies that the jail was undertaking. And so that kind of release, that kind of not being incarcerated, that kind of supposed decarceration, to me, really hones in on the problematic aspects of medicalizing the jail system. So, and this kind of thing where Jen's talking about the medicalization of the social safety net. And that is because it's not a righteous indignation of the meaning of incarceration. It's not an abolitionist perspective to say, you can't be in here because of sort of potential sickness, illness. That provides administrators with a solution, a temporary solution to release some from jail, to reconstitute dying institutions. Instead, I would take an abolitionary perspective, that it's not okay for me to be in jail because it has lifelong consequences, and because I don't deserve it from just walking around the street. And so that's where to me, the implication of my argument is. It's that abolitionary perspective. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I agree with what Armando is saying. I can think about how the pandemic has shifted the ambulance as well. I did some follow-up interviews with people who were in my field site, but also with EMTs and paramedics across the country I guess this was last March, was the beginning of the pandemic. And what we saw was interesting, right? Because like on the news, especially the mainstream news, we saw, you know, especially in New York, you know, hospitals were overwhelmed. There was such a shortage of ambulances in New York City that FEMA had to send ambulances into the city. But while this was happening, while New York was essentially on fire with the coronavirus, other agencies, essentially all the ones I talked to, from Baltimore to rural areas in Texas, but also urban areas in California and Washington, across the country, call volume actually dramatically went down. And this was in part because I think people were afraid to interact with emergency departments, especially at that period. And I say that because there's other evidence that people were avoiding regular healthcare encounters. And so I wrote a little article about how I had concerns about what this means for the people who depend on the ambulance for things like primary care, for getting prescription refills and things like that. And I also had concerns about what it means for the people who sell their labor power to the ambulance firms, right? Those who depend on the ambulance for a paycheck. was a lot of places across the country that were cutting hours. There was a lot of places that were threatening layoffs. It didn't actually end up panning out that way because it ended up increasing demand later on. But I think the pandemic helped reveal, I mean, a lot of problems in society, but I think one of the things that helped reveal my case was the problems of commodified ambulance care and commodified healthcare in general, and what happens when you're just adjusting your system in response to the concerns of the market when people really depend on those institutions, including both patients who depend on it for care, and also the workers who depend on it for a paycheck. Yeah, I have a similar opinion about that, about abolition as well. You know, sometimes the ambulance stuff was getting thrown into some of these early conversations, or not early, but previous conversations about abolition, because there was conversations about like, well, maybe you just dispatch an ambulance or you dispatch social workers to respond to a series of these crises. And oh, if that's the choice that we have, ambulance or police, to somebody who's having a psychiatric behavioral emergency, absolutely I'm on board. Send the ambulance instead of the police. There's no evidence in my study, in my 2-year study, that we need the police on those settings. As I say, I don't think the police really made me feel safe as an EMT. I don't really think I'm like a tough guy or anything like that, but I really didn't think the police made me feel particularly safe, with the exception of them controlling traffic. Like when there was like a traffic collision and I was on the street on a highway and people were blowing past me like 70, 80 miles an hour, that was the time in which I most feared for my life. And I was happy that there was somebody there guiding traffic away. Now, I don't necessarily think that we need police officers to do that. So if that's our choice, ambulance, police, yes, the ambulance. But, you know, as Jen mentioned, this distinction between criminalization and medicalization is incredibly blurred. And a lot of medical institutions, and Armando's study helps illustrate this too, have kind of adopted carceral logics and punitive logics to them, including things like forced restraint, chemical sedation, and a series of other things. So abolition, and I don't think I'm alone in thinking this, right? But I think if you're gonna think about abolition and you're thinking about with respect to hospitals, it must also mean hospitals and healthcare institutions. It means revising those institutions as well. And I want to say just one really quick thing in response to what both Michael and Jen were saying with respect to the clientele experience. So yeah, I still think that I don't even think it's necessarily a shortcomings of the books that they don't account. I mean, it is that they don't account for the clientele experience, but it is really an effect of the method in some ways. Like our methods are not methods that really draw us into the lives of patients. Like I only got to know patients to the extent that they were in the ambulance. Now, sometimes many of them were in there day in and day out, so I got to know them a little bit better, but a lot of the people only encountered them inside the ambulance. So when people ask me, like, well, what's their daily life like? It's like, well, I don't know. I only know their life when they encounter the ambulance. This does not mean, in response to Michael's comment, this does not mean that patients in the ambulance are completely passive, right? They do have power, and I don't want to use this language of dialectic either, but they do have power to shape how they are worked upon. And so I have a section in the book called Chief Complainers, and it has to do with how patients articulate their medical complaint. Most ambulance patients are relatively lucid enough to articulate a medical complaint, and they can strategically do that, including saying, I got chest pain, knowing that that's going to perhaps lead them toward a cardiac center rather than toward another clinical space. And so the chief complainers, as I call them, and I don't call them that to be demeaning, that in the field, it's EMS protocols refer to that as a chief complaint. It's basically, how does the person self-diagnose their problem? And I also write about something called incarceritis, which is this idea that people are malingering, exaggerating their illnesses, or making up illnesses when they are incarcerated or when they are arrested in an effort to redirect themselves away from the jail. And so I write about that, and I don't write about, there's already people who write about incarceritis in the medical professional literature, and they tend to demonize this activity and think about it as, there's a lot of stigmatization that goes behind it, but I see it as a very strategic way to avoid the jail when you want to avoid the jail. If you're arrested and you can say, hey, I have chest pain, and if this means that they're going to then send you into an ambulance, even if it's avoiding the jail for a few hours. And I think that's the case, a lot of people who are doing incarceritis, which was not widespread, I should say. It's generally a low frequency pattern I observed in my data. But I think it's another example of somebody's about to get arrested, they're about to be taken to the jail, and they still have some control, even under that most oppressive circumstance, to at least adjust a little bit how they are processed and managed. Now, Does that mean that they have full agency or full discretion over how it is that they're managed by these institutions? No, but it does suggest that they have some agency.
I could jump in again. I was hearing you guys talk, I keep thinking about this criminalizing versus medicalizing, and you know, sometimes like hearing the discussion, I'm like, yeah, it's sort of it's easy to sort of think this criminalizing thing is going on, but Josh telling us that ambulance volume went down during the pandemic, it cued a report I read about, you know, as you said, ED volume going down during the pandemic as well. And physicians were complaining because they sort of weren't making the same kind of revenue that they had been before, and on non-urgent patients, because non-urgent patients weren't showing up to the ER anymore. And it tripped me out, because it's like, those are the exact patients that you all complain about constantly for showing up at the ER. And now you're worried about them not coming because they're not providing you money. And so that cued another thought about the role of public funding for medicine in Josh's book, and how that's driving a lot of these institutions. And so here, instead of criminalization, we're actually thinking of medicalization. And I don't think people, and I don't think, frankly, I don't think many sociologists have an appreciation for the sheer amount of revenue available when you tap into a medical frame of things. So public spending on medicine, I mean, it's gone from something like 8% of GDP to 17% of GDP in the past 20 years. It's I think 40% of the federal budget, and that's compared to the defense budget of 15%. So like the sheer, and when that money's available, I mean, nonprofits, public agencies, all in their efforts to do good, see this form of revenue, and that shapes a lot of the content and the things they have available to them. And, you know, so for instance, in Josh's book, and the ambulance, you know, it's sort of like, the idea is we want to get to the rich clients because they'll actually pay the $2,000, $3,000 ambulance bill. But it's sort of regulators that are forcing them to be in working class neighborhoods, you know, because they don't really make much money there. And the idea is because Medicaid only pays 10% of that $2,000 bill. So I want to like think about how that 10% is actually a shit ton of money. And that $2,000, $3,000 is just the list price set up by companies. And we see this all over in hospitals. I mean, they're constructing the price. That tapping into federal dollars provides sort of tax benefits, all kinds of things. And so when I think about the story of poverty governance, and, you know, I think about, it makes me want to think about how medicalizing is this way of making money off the suffering of people. And this funds middle-class jobs for ambulance workers. This funds high-end jobs for doctors. And I mean, I'm taking a hard stance here, but it cued me into this thinking of medicalization of our country's problems. As to put my cards on the table, I think that money could be spent better elsewhere. Perhaps in wealth transfers, perhaps in childcare, perhaps in housing, things that actually might make an effect on healthcare disparities rather than medicine itself.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off that. I totally agree. I think that, you know, we don't pay enough attention to medicalization of social services and of governmental services in general. In my book, I refer to it as a safety net of gauze. So it's a safety net, but it's a safety net that only catches people who are not just poor, but poor and sick. And, you know, Armando and I are in good company in making this argument. So Helena Hansen in New York also writes about this in terms of following welfare reform from AFDC to TANF. We see a number of people increase on the disability roll, right? So people were claiming, I mean, the argument that she's making is that a lot of people got displaced through the shift from AFDC to TANF, that a lot of people then turned to disability to get these services. And we also have research showing that emergency department visits at this same time after welfare reform also increase. So people are turning to one of the few institutions that promise them, and medicine is one of those few institutions. And I think it makes some sense, not in a like some theoretical sense at least, not necessarily practical or political sense, but some theoretical sense when you consider medicine is as medical sociologists have long been telling us, from Zola to Conrad to others, that medicine is this sort of modern repository of truth in a highly rationalized society. It is the institution that essentially legitimates suffering. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that emergency departments, ambulances are providing a lot of these services in that context. And I also think it makes a lot of sense that jails and other institutions, schools, are absorbing medical practices. I think the new discourse on the deserving poor is being poor and sick, or at least that's part of the new discourse.
I just want to jump in for a moment to sort of tee up our audience questions. So if you have a question, please type it into the chat, or just type a question mark into the chat and I'll call on you and let you speak. I don't see anything quite yet. So in the meantime, our panelists can continue their conversation. I didn't know if Michael or Jen wanted to follow up on any of their questions. And then when I start to see stuff in the chat, I'll jump in.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in just real quick. I just following up on the comments that were just made, I guess two things I wanted to make. One, I wanted to point, what I loved about both of your books was that you showed, because I think there is this idea that you know, people are taking advantage, they're you know, sort of saying they're sick when they're not, to get whatever services. And I loved how you both showed how that operated in multiple directions. It's not just the people, it's the systems themselves that are labeling people as sick for different reasons. And I guess I'm curious, do you think that that this shifting, the availability of this resources, the acceptability of illness, of people being ill as being, you know, more and more as being seen potentially as a deserving poor, does that change who we classify as sick? Are our boundaries of sickness changing? And how then do workers in these settings respond to that?
Josh, what happens when ambulance providers show up to a rich house that they don't think the people are very sick, but there's a panic attack going on? People are just medicalizing their problems.
Yeah, generally, you know, something kind of similar happens. I think the main difference is that just the volume of calls, be they for these legit calls or these bullshit calls, the volume of them, they all concentrate towards the urban flatlands and in the poor and working class areas. But yeah, surprisingly, in my you know, in my research when I was in the field, a lot of people would be like, oh yeah, I like to go up to the hills, or, you know, into these mansions and areas like that. They would tell me, oh, that they're, you know, they're more likely to have real emergencies up there. That was a prevalent myth that I heard. And then when I looked at my medical records and I was able to geocode them to the census tract level, and I calculated, I don't have like a code for legit and bullshit, but I have a code for medical severity. And it looks at the actual interventions that were performed, and we can classify them in terms of how severe they were or how deep they were into the body in some ways. And I didn't find a significant pattern to suggest that there was a higher legit to bullshit ratio in the hills versus in the flatlands, because there was a number of people like on private insurance, particularly elderly people, who would have like life alert buttons and things like that, that you get false alarms. So you get a lot of relatively false alarm calls in those areas. I do think that those populations, like wealthy populations, were easier to talk out of transport, easier to talk them out of actually taking an ambulance if they asked for it, because you could convince them, say, hey, is there another way you can get there? And chances are they are less socially isolated and have a, you know, more research network of people that could provide them with a ride to the hospital. And so you could essentially talk them out of it. Whereas some people in the urban flatland areas, you know, you would sometimes have these conversations saying, hey, can you get somebody else to get to the hospital? This is gonna be a big bill. You know, do you really wanna go? And they, no, there's nobody to take me. So can you please take me? And at that point you have to take them. So I do think there was some ways to convince people, you know, in the wealthier areas not to go, but perhaps not as, you know, as much as you'd think. And I think the main pattern here is that ambulance responses were concentrating downward.
I've got a, unless somebody wants to respond, I've got a slightly different question. Yeah, one of the things that strikes me is, I think from both your studies, definitively from Armando, is that the so-called neoliberal state is a regulatory state, and and when I hear Armando, it's a well-resourced state too. So the mythology of somehow that the neoliberal state is a stripped-down state seems to be violated by both your books. Josh is not that clear because we don't have and that's the significance of Armando's book, that in Josh's book there isn't really, with all due respect, a historical sequence where we can see what ambulances were like, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, and whether there were more services for the so-called underclass. But it raises the question that Armando raised and Jen raised, was what is this business of crisis, the disappearing crisis, which I find a fascinating idea. And I think Jen was finding it interesting too. But what is this crisis that is disappearing? Now, you can think of crises in two forms. One is a social crisis, a subjective crisis, and one can think of it as a systemic crisis, which might be a crisis of actually these agencies. And I'm wondering if you could unpack and how, I would be interested how Josh thinks. I don't remember Josh really referring to crises at all. And so I'm wondering whether you can unpack this idea of crisis. What is this crisis that is disappearing? Is this really just the disappearance of urban suffering? Or is there something more to the word crisis?
I've been struggling with that, Michael. I continue to work on this idea of what actually is the crisis here, and I guess where I'm at now is what's disappearing is this like potential for change, potential for like moments where like austerity would threaten like it threatens a jail's mandate, and there's like this moment of like serious reform that's possible, and taking suffering very seriously. And like it's like a crisis in organizational mandates, but and that potential for change disappears. I mean, that's kind of where I'm at with it right now.
Well, that's really interesting, because we always think of crisis as being the potential for change, and you're saying it's the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And of course, the idea of austerity itself is a fabrication. If we read do you think that's the case too? Well, austerity is a constructed idea, mm-hmm. Given or is it actually? I mean, or in what sense is it real?
My mind goes to Josh Soss's work in Joe Soss's work and Joshua Page's work at Minnesota, where they talk about neoliberalism as kind of the dual effort to break down public institutions, but also sell it to private entities, right? So it's this, I guess the latter is downplayed in my book, and and whereas in Josh's book that seems pretty clear, like there's money being made here.
Yeah. I'll say in terms of crisis, I don't use that language in my book. To the extent that it would be integrated, it would be about sort of personal crises and personal catastrophes, and how there's an unequal distribution of them, and how they tend to concentrate towards the bottom of the economically and racially polarized city. And the ambulance is there to provide, a presentation of handling those crises. So, it is the case that if somebody is laying in the middle of the street screaming, chances are at some point an ambulance crew or some similar institution will come and handle that population and take them away, or at least cycle them through an institutional space, at least temporarily. And I think it does present this disappearing of those personal crises, certainly from public view. I think it does do that. And I think, there is a lot of, for example, like in my research, what do we think about like what would be problematic about the ambulance? I think people tend to think, well, the ambulance would be really problematic from like a social justice standpoint if it was absent in poor neighborhoods and if it was tardy in poor neighborhoods. And there's no shortage of journalists and even some academics and some sociologists who have made such claims, right? But in my case, ambulances were more frequent in poor neighborhoods, and they actually were not more likely to be late in those areas. Mm-hmm. And so it presents itself as seem like, oh, it's a great institution. It's all this policy success. And it largely ignores the fact that nonetheless, it's still an institution that's not targeting the root causes of people's suffering. And then with respect to the neoliberal state, for me, you know, and I tend to avoid that language too, which I think is interesting. Armando tends to avoid it too. I don't think really either of us do a lot to talk about neoliberalism. Although somebody who is interested in neoliberalism could read our books through those frameworks. But I think, I don't want to speak for Armando, but I think we're both kind of avoiding that kind of common boogeyman of neoliberalism. But to Michael's point about neoliberalism, you know, it not being a retrenchment of the state, from my case, you know, it's a private ambulance firm that's contracted out. And I think a lot of people assume that that's evidence of the so-called hollow state, right? An absence of the state. And that's not the case for my study, at least. The state remains present and powerful because it continues to monitor and to sanction the performance of this company that it's delegating its operations out to. Closely monitors its response times, closely monitors its presence in poor neighborhoods. And if it's late to those neighborhoods, or if it's late anywhere, they will begin to fine the company. And so the bureaucracy, the public bureaucracy, is very present and powerful. It wasn't the story in my book, at least, about a hollowing out of the state, which is often a common narrative you hear about neoliberalism.
And I'll just jump in because we do have some comments and questions in the chat. I'll go ahead. I see we definitely have a range of audience members today. We have some practitioners in both medical and other fields. I'll start with Liz Chiarello. I apologize if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, who indicated she had a question. Liz, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Great, thanks, Anne. So it's and I say I'm frozen in a very awkward position, but I will keep talking. Okay, so it is such a pleasure to be here and actually to look at these two books side by side. I've been familiar with both of your work for a long time. And I think about your work as part of this vanguard in sociological and socio-legal studies on the relationship between law and medicine, whether we're talking at the front lines or we're talking historically. I think there are two major narratives in those arenas. One of them is this revolving door narrative that I think you're both telling, where people get moved from one space to the next. Nobody really ends up solving the problem. And the other is more of a blurring of boundaries narrative that I think we see with things like drug courts, for example, where you have these medical logics and you have these legal logics and they're existing in the same space. And then the question is, how does the social problem get addressed in those spaces? But the term that keeps coming to mind to me as I hear your work is futility. And it's futility at the federal and the state level in terms of how money is being spent to try to address a social problem that never quite gets addressed. And it's futility on the ground, Josh, in your work when we're talking about workers who are dealing with bullshit cases. And you know, those aren't the cases they dreamed about dealing with when they decided to become an EMT. They thought they were going to deal with heart attacks and other really serious issues. And instead, you know, they're picking someone up out of a chair and putting them, you know, or cleaning up an orange juice spill is something I've seen. And so there's a lot of frustration, a lot of futility. And I think ultimately these problems just don't get solved. And I'm curious from your perspective, you know, Armando, you talked a little bit about removing money from healthcare and putting it somewhere else, into childcare and into housing and into some of these other institutions that might address the problem. But like, what is the benefit of just moving people around and never solving the problem? Is it A, because they're not deserving enough to have the problem solved? Is it B, because these problems are unsolvable? Is it C, that they're incompletely medicalized and incompletely criminalized and we can't quite figure out what to do with them? Or is it just austerity? Is it that we don't have enough money? We know the right thing to do, but we don't have enough money, or is it something else?
Great question, Liz. Good to see
And
you.
I've thrown a lot at you, I realize.
You want to take a stab, Josh?
I mean, I don't want to sound like incredibly pessimistic here, but I want to suggest that there are kind of variations in how the state can handle suffering. But, you know, I end my book, at least, with a paragraph kind of acknowledging that suffering suffering in a multitude of forms, mental, physical, emotional, people have extended to ideas of social suffering, structural suffering, financial suffering. This just seems forever weighed down towards the bottom of a class and racial hierarchy, as well as other hierarchies. And so without serious disruptions to those hierarchies, it's hard for me in those systems of oppression and exploitation, it's hard for me to imagine the state ever fully accomplishing its mission beyond simply mitigating the suffering of people at the bottom. I mean, mitigating suffering is certainly better than exacerbating suffering, right? So if the choice, as I said earlier, is the police or the ambulance, you should choose the ambulance. It's more likely to mitigate that suffering than it is to exacerbate it when compared to the police. But I don't know for sure if, you know, it's entirely clear to me like a great option. And, you know, even strengthening the social safety net, decarceration and other things like that, I'm certainly on board with. But I think that at some point we need to acknowledge that suffering is forever going to be weighed towards the bottom of these urban hierarchies under systems of capitalism and racism. And so the question is, do you disrupt those systems, or find out ways to disrupt those systems, and to think about ways to connect, say, these kinds of conversations with social movements that are having conversations on disrupting those systems? Or do we consider to think about statecraft and how to craft the state under the existing circumstances to make them more mitigating than they are exacerbating? So it's a tough set of questions. I don't really have much of an answer. I sort of softball it, or I don't know what the phrase would be here, but I sort of punt on the question. I don't know sports. So I do something at the end of my book to sort of not offer a clear answer to this question, and somewhat pessimistic in my response on it.
I know we have to go. I can summarize my response in one sentence. I think economic inequality has widened tremendously in the past 30 years. And in order to deal with that, we're pouring money into these kinds of institutions. And I think we need to really rethink that.
Thank you so much. And we are at the end of our time. I want to thank our panelists so much for their comments today and for the contributions in these two excellent books. I apologize, we do have a couple questions and comments in the chat that we didn't quite get to. I'm going to share the chat with our panelists, and feel free to follow up offline as well. But with that, please join me in virtually or otherwise clapping and thanking our panelists. And I hope everyone has a wonderful, hopefully long weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ann.
My pleasure.